He could buy anything, except the peace that came when she smiled. One meal, one heartbeat, and the man who hated women began to crave the one who refused to fear him. Before we start, tap subscribe. Tomorrow I'm dropping another story that'll blow your mind. Let me know where you're watching from, then buckle up. The morning sun crawled across the Pacific horizon, brushing the surface of Jeffery Williams's glass fortress with gold. From the outside, his mansion stood like a crown above the cliffs, sleek, commanding, untouchable. Inside, it was a shrine to silence. Every wall gleamed, every surface unblemished, every sound swallowed by the hum of automation. It was a perfect world, engineered to keep life at a safe distance. Jeffery Williams was a man who had mastered the art of isolation. 35, brilliant, absurdly wealthy, and yet profoundly alone. His empire ran on precision and numbers, a reflection of the mind that built it, cold, analytical, and closed off. He had learned long ago that emotion was a liability, and connection, a cost he could not afford. Behind his controlled exterior lay the ruins of old wounds. A mother who had traded love for money, a fiancé who had bartered loyalty for fame. Their betrayals had written in him a quiet, permanent creed, that love was a transaction and women were the negotiators. Since then, he had withdrawn from the world and its demands, letting solitude become his fortress and his punishment. In his kingdom of glass, nothing stirred his pulse. Not the endless ocean, not the awards on his shelves, not the empty seat at his dining table. He had everything, yet nothing. The human voice had become a stranger, the scent of warmth and home an intrusion. The world believed he hated women, but the truth was simpler and sadder. He feared them. He feared the mirror they held up, the reflection of a man who once longed to be loved. On the other side of the city, Olivia Roberts was stirring onions in a tiny apartment kitchen that smelled of hope and exhaustion. Her hands moved with practiced grace, swift, steady, sure, yet her eyes carried the weight of too many unfinished dreams. Cooking was her language of love, the way she spoke when words failed. Each meal she made was a small rebellion against despair. Life had not been kind to her. Her father's illness had drained her savings and her sleep, leaving behind debt, anxiety, and nights filled with the soft whir of hospital machines. Yet through it all, Olivia had refused to surrender her spirit. Where others saw endings, she tried to see recipes, new combinations, new chances, new flavors of faith. In her world, the aroma of caramelized onions and garlic stood where luxury should have been. There were no polished walls, no automated voices responding to commands, only the sound of her father's slow breathing and the soft scrape of a wooden spoon against metal. Yet somehow, in that modest kitchen, there was more life than in all the marble halls of Jeffery Williams's empire. Their worlds were destined to meet, not through fate's poetry but through life's quiet practicality. Jeffrey's assistant had been searching for a replacement chef, one willing to live on site. Most candidates had refused. The man's reputation was enough to chill any enthusiasm. But Olivia, cornered by bills and hope, accepted without hesitation. She needed the income. Her father needed the medication. If she had to endure the cold of a billionaire's house to save him, she would. When she arrived at the estate days later, she stepped into a world that did not breathe. Every sound felt foreign, the echo of her footsteps, the faint hum of electricity, the rhythm of her heartbeat against walls that seemed to listen but not respond. The man who met her there was exactly as described. Sharp, distant, immaculate. His eyes held no curiosity, only control. And yet, in the briefest moment, she noticed something he had forgotten to hide. It wasn't cruelty, it was emptiness. A quiet, tired kind of ache that spoke louder than words ever could. She did not flinch from it. She simply nodded and went to work. The kitchen became her stage, her battlefield, her offering. The scent of rosemary and butter began to weave through the cold air, replacing the sterile perfection with something human. For the first time in years, warmth dared to challenge stillness in Jeffrey's home. The clatter of pans, the hiss of oil, the rhythm of chopping. Each sound chipped away at the silence that had guarded him for so long. When she served the meal, a simple dish of salmon with lemon and herbs, it was more than food. It was an unspoken invitation to feel again. He took a single bite, expecting nothing. But in that instant, memory ambushed him. The taste of his mother's cooking before the world broke, the warmth of laughter that once filled a house long gone. He froze, fork suspended in disbelief, because the flavor carried a ghost he had buried decades ago. He said nothing, but inside, something small and stubborn stirred, like the faint ember of a fire thought long extinguished. He would spend the rest of the evening trying to convince himself it was nothing, just a meal, just a flavor, just a woman doing her job. Yet long after the plates were cleared and the lights dimmed, he found himself standing at his window, staring into the ocean's endless dark, wondering why silence no longer felt like peace. Olivia, back in her modest apartment, washed the scent of butter and lemon from her hands, unaware of the shift she had caused. She was simply grateful for the opportunity, for the steady paycheck, for the quiet dignity of work well done. She thought little of the man who had eaten her food in silence. To her, he was just another employer, strange, detached, and distant. But the universe had begun its quiet orchestration. Two souls, bruised in different ways, had entered each other's orbits, one guarded by steel and glass, the other by kindness and endurance. Neither knew yet how deeply their lives would entwine, nor how profoundly they would change one another. The mansion slept that night, but something within it had awakened. The walls still gleamed, the sea still murmured, but the silence had altered, no longer empty, but expectant. Somewhere in that stillness, a man who had forgotten how to feel began to remember what it meant to be alive. And miles away, a woman who thought she was only cooking for survival had already begun to change the course of a man's soul. The following morning arrived not with change, but with routine. Or so Jeffery Williams believed. The mansion moved like a machine, precise and impersonal. Screens flickered to life, the coffee brewed itself, and a distant voice confirmed his meeting schedule. Yet beneath the surface of order, something subtle had shifted. It wasn't visible, not even audible, just a faint unease in the silence, as if the air itself remembered a scent it couldn't let go of. He tried to ignore it. He buried himself in numbers, reports, and strategy calls, yet his focus faltered. Between sentences, between breaths, he caught traces of it. The distant rhythm of footsteps from the kitchen, the quiet clink of silver against steel, the low hum of someone existing within his carefully walled world. It was disconcerting, and oddly, grounding. Jeffery had always prided himself on detachment. Feelings to him were weaknesses disguised as art. But something about Olivia's presence unsettled that equation. Her energy didn't demand attention, it created it. She didn't fill his mansion with sound, she gave its silence a pulse. All day, he fought distraction. Yet when the sun dipped beneath the horizon and the ocean turned to liquid gold, he found himself walking toward the dining room, drawn by an aroma so rich it seemed to hum against the walls. The table was already set. Candlelight trembled against glass, the scent of seared herbs and citrus threading the air. For a moment, Jeffery hesitated at the doorway, an intruder in his own home. The scene felt too alive, too human, too intimate. He was used to the metallic gleam of solitude, not this quiet warmth that seemed to welcome him. She wasn't there when he entered. Only the food awaited him, arranged with care and restraint. A meal designed not to impress, but to comfort. He sat slowly, as though the act itself carried weight, and lifted the fork. The first taste was immediate, flavor deep and clean, precise yet familiar. And with that, the flood began. He didn't remember falling backward into memory. It simply happened. One moment he was tasting her food, the next he was a boy again, sitting in a small kitchen lit by morning sun. His mother hummed as she cooked, the scent of lemon butter filling the air. He remembered the warmth of her hands, the safety of her laughter, the way she'd call him, my little man. Then the memory fractured. The humming stopped. The kitchen went silent. The sound of a door closing replaced it. The day she left, chasing a life she said was bigger than theirs. Jeffrey blinked, and the mansion returned. The chair beneath him, the candle flickering, the empty room, it all felt heavier now. He realized, with an ache that startled him, that the food had not just filled his stomach. It had cracked something open inside him. He pushed the plate away, unsettled by how fragile it made him feel. But fragility, once awakened, doesn't return quietly. It lingers. It whispers. It questions. That night he couldn't sleep. The ocean roared beneath his windows, restless and alive. In the darkness he found himself thinking of her. Not as an employee, not as a stranger, but as the presence that had dared to interrupt his silence. He wondered what kind of woman cooked like that. What kind of heart poured warmth into something so simple. Meanwhile, Olivia worked late in the kitchen, unaware of the storm she'd stirred. To her, it was just another day, another meal, another job she needed to keep. Yet there was something in the air she couldn't name. The mansion no longer felt cold. It felt cautious, like a great beast learning to breathe again. She moved through the kitchen with quiet grace, cleaning as she always did, humming softly to herself. The sound carried faintly through the halls. Somewhere above, Jeffrey heard it, gentle, human, alive. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't command his system to mute it. In the days that followed, their invisible rhythm continued. She cooked. He avoided the dining room until she left. But every night, he found himself drawn to the table, to the warmth her meals left behind. He'd sit there long after the food had gone cold, as though trying to absorb whatever it was she brought with her. It wasn't desire, not yet. It was curiosity, confusion, a sense of life returning in small, unwelcome waves. And beneath that, fear. He caught himself wondering what her laughter sounded like, whether she smiled when she cooked, whether she pitied him. The thoughts irritated him, not because they were sentimental, but because they existed at all. He had spent years constructing walls so thick even memory couldn't breach them, and now one woman's presence was softening them, one plate at a time. For Olivia, the job was both blessing and burden. She could feel his distance like a physical temperature. The mansion's silence pressed down on her, yet she refused to be intimidated by it. There was something profoundly sad about its perfection, something lonely in its immaculate design. She didn't know what had shaped the man who lived here, but she sensed the residue of pain, an ache that even wealth couldn't hide. So she cooked not for approval, but for comfort. She filled the air with warmth, as though to remind the house, and maybe its owner, that life could still exist here. Each dish became a quiet offering, a prayer folded into flavor. She didn't realize that every time she left, Jeffrey found himself watching the door she disappeared through, long after it had closed. The ocean outside continued its endless breathing, as if echoing the rhythm awakening between them. He told himself it meant nothing, that it was simply novelty, the shock of human presence after years of isolation. But late one night, standing by the window with a glass of untouched wine, he admitted something he hadn't dared in years. He felt alive again, and he hated it, because feeling meant remembering, and remembering meant vulnerability. But the truth had already begun its quiet invasion. The walls that had protected him were no longer fortresses. They were prisons, and every scent, every sound, every trace of her kindness was another crack in the armor he'd built to keep the world out. Somewhere in the echo of the mansion's silence, the seed of change had taken root. It would not bloom quickly, nor gently, but it would grow. And when it did, neither of them would ever be the same. If someone unknowingly awakened feelings you had buried long ago, would you let them in or rebuild the walls even higher? Share your thoughts below. What would you do if warmth began to scare you more than loneliness? Jeffery Williams began the week with a renewed devotion to logic. Emotion, he told himself, was a glitch, an error in the system he'd spent years perfecting. It had slipped through cracks he hadn't realized were there, and now he intended to seal them shut. He ordered his meals delivered to his office. He adjusted schedules, altered protocols, and instructed his assistant to minimize unnecessary presence in his living quarters. The words were clinical, precise, his usual defense mechanism. Yet beneath them pulsed something distinctly human: fear. He feared the growing hum in his chest each time he remembered her voice drifting through the hallways, that quiet tune she hummed when she thought no one could hear. He feared the way her scent lingered in the air, faint but unforgettable, a reminder that someone had existed near him, not for profit or power, but for purpose. So he withdrew. Silence returned. Control, or something like it, reasserted itself. But control was not peace anymore. It was effort. It was exhaustion dressed as order. The mansion that once comforted him with its mechanical stillness now echoed too loudly. The click of his own shoes against marble mocked him with its hollowness. He buried himself in work. Numbers never judged. Algorithms didn't smile. They obeyed. They conformed. They filled the space where human warmth once threatened to bloom. Yet every now and then he would glance at the corner of his desk, where a small container sat, forgotten, holding the remnants of the meal she'd prepared before his retreat. He hadn't thrown it away. He told himself it was laziness. Deep down, he knew it was denial. Olivia, meanwhile, noticed the shift immediately. She no longer saw him crossing the hall or sitting at the table after meals. The air in the mansion felt heavier, colder again, as though her brief success in warming it had been erased overnight. Still, she cooked. She kept the kitchen alive, even if the rest of the house resisted her touch. Cooking was her prayer against indifference. She didn't need his praise or company. She needed to believe that something good could exist even in places built to repel it. The act of creation itself was her defiance. But as days passed, she felt the distance like frost creeping under the door. There was no anger, only quiet, a silence that had weight, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. One afternoon, while preparing a meal for a charity event he'd refused to attend, she looked around and realized how little life existed there. No laughter, no art, no color, just glass and steel and the faint echo of emptiness. She wondered how someone could choose to live this way. She didn't know that at that very moment, Jeffery was upstairs, standing at his window, watching the ocean crash against the rocks. He had ignored her presence all week, yet his mind refused to follow his orders. The more he tried to suppress the memory of her, the stronger it returned. He remembered her steady hands, the way she moved with quiet confidence, the way her eyes had met his without flinching. She hadn't looked at him with awe or judgment, just recognition. And that somehow had terrified him more than any betrayal could. Because recognition meant she saw him, not the billionaire, not the recluse, but the man who hid behind both. That night, as the tide rose below, the mansion's power flickered. A storm was approaching. The wind howled against the glass, and thunder rolled like an ancient warning. The lights dimmed, then returned. Even nature seemed restless, mirroring the turmoil he refused to name. In the kitchen, Olivia stayed late to ensure the generators held. Rain hammered the windows, her reflection blurred in the glass, two versions of herself staring back, the dreamer and the survivor. She thought of her father, his fading smile, his quiet pride that she kept going. Everything she did was for him, yet somewhere inside she longed for someone to see her. Not as the helper, not as the caretaker, but as a woman still capable of being loved. That wish frightened her almost as much as Jeffrey's silence did. And so both of them resisted. Their reasons different, their defenses identical. He resisted the unknown pull toward warmth. She resisted the foolish hope that warmth could ever last. Days blurred, Meals came and went. The mansion became a strange purgatory of polite distance. Yet under the surface, something alive refused to die. It pulsed faintly, waiting. Jeffrey began noticing small things again. Details he wished he hadn't. The faint trace of her laughter carried through the vents when she spoke to herself while cooking. The soft hum of the oven timer, the rustle of her apron, the gentle rhythm of her existence, all reminders that he was not as alone as he pretended to be. And Olivia, despite her attempts at detachment, felt herself anticipating the sound of his footsteps. Even when he never came, even when the hours stretched long and empty, she would sometimes glance at the door as if expecting it to open. She didn't know why. Perhaps hope, once awakened, is a difficult thing to silence. The storm outside grew louder, the wind clawing at the house as if demanding entry. Inside, both souls clung to their patterns of denial, two hearts pretending indifference while standing on the edge of transformation. Jeffrey would later tell himself that he resisted because logic demanded it. The truth was simpler. He resisted because she made him feel alive. And life, real, unguarded, unpredictable, was the one thing he no longer knew how to survive. For Olivia, resistance came cloaked in duty. She told herself she was there to work, to earn, to help her father. Yet every plate she placed before his absence felt like a message she couldn't stop sending. I'm still here, and you are still human. The mansion once again fell silent that night. But it was not the same silence as before. It was restless, aching, alive with everything left unsaid. In that tension, their story deepened. The storm outside would soon find its echo inside these walls, and when it did, no amount of logic would be enough to contain what had already begun. The storm began just after midnight. Rain fell not as a whisper, but as an assault. Sheets of water drumming against the glass walls of Jeffery Williams' mansion like 1,000 unanswered questions. The power surged twice, then failed completely. The screens died, the silence grew thick, and the world beyond disappeared into darkness. Jeffrey, still in his office, stared at the dead monitors. For a man who built his empire on control, the sudden stillness felt foreign, almost violent. The hum of technology had always been his armor. Now, it was gone. For a long moment, he sat unmoving. Then reluctantly he rose. The emergency lights flickered on, dim and amber, revealing a version of his home that looked human, imperfect, alive. Shadows trembled across the marble, and somewhere far below he could hear movement. Olivia. She had stayed later than usual, preparing the next day's menu, unaware that the world outside had turned to chaos. In the kitchen, the generator buzzed uncertainly, trying to hold the line. She wiped her hands on a towel and glanced toward the ceiling as thunder rolled. The building shuddered. Power dipped again. Then darkness. Her breath caught. She wasn't afraid of storms. She was afraid of what storms revealed. How small and fragile everything became when nature reminded humanity of its limits. She fumbled for her phone. No signal. The outside world had vanished. The house itself felt like a ship adrift in the middle of nowhere. Moments later, footsteps echoed through the hall, measured, firm, too deliberate to belong to panic. She froze, listening. The sound drew closer, steady as a heartbeat. Jeffrey appeared at the edge of the kitchen's faint candlelight. He looked different without the glow of technology framing him. His face, once hard with precision, seemed softened by shadow. The storm had stripped them both of their masks. He surveyed the scene, the flickering candles, the faint scent of rosemary and lemon, the calm determination on her face. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't waiting for rescue. She was steady. Something about that steadiness disarmed him. He should have left, retreated to his study, sealed himself behind walls, but the power failure made that impossible. The system that usually obeyed him now ignored every command. The elevator was dead, the security panels offline. They were both trapped inside a fortress built for solitude, now powerless to separate them. The irony didn't escape him. Olivia broke the tension with quiet purpose. She lit another candle, its glow casting warm circles against the walls. The mansion, stripped of its sterile perfection, felt strangely intimate now, almost like a home. Jeffrey remained near the doorway, his posture rigid, as though unsure whether to stay or flee. But there was nowhere to go. The storm was unrelenting. The roads flooded. The world had conspired to trap two people who had spent their lives avoiding the very thing they now couldn't escape: each other. Hours passed in fragmented silence. Olivia moved through the kitchen, organizing supplies, checking the backup generators. Jeffrey watched, saying nothing. The air between them was heavy, but not hostile, charged, uncertain, alive. He noticed things he hadn't before: the precision of her movements, the faint line of concentration between her brows, the quiet dignity with which she handled small disasters. She didn't panic. She adapted. It fascinated him, someone who met chaos with grace. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped. Without power, the mansion's automated heating failed. Breath became visible hanging in the cold air. Olivia wrapped her arms around herself, more from instinct than vanity. Jeffrey noticed the gesture. For the first time in years, something in him shifted, a flicker of empathy where indifference used to live. Without thinking, he crossed the room. Not close, but closer. Enough to stand within the radius of candlelight that separated them. The silence felt less like distance now and more like the space before understanding. He didn't speak, but his presence filled the room differently this time, not as authority, but as a man stripped of control. Olivia could feel the change in the air, though neither of them acknowledged it. The rain softened briefly, then returned harder than before. The power's hum stuttered, failed again. The mansion groaned under the weight of the wind. And so, they stayed. Two strangers tethered by circumstance, pretending the world hadn't shifted in the dark. Olivia busied herself preparing something warm from what she could find. Soup made over a gas flame, bread warmed by candlelight. It was a humble act, but it carried the weight of defiance, comfort in the face of chaos. Jeffrey, unused to being cared for in any form, felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest. Gratitude, vulnerability. The difference was blurred. The moment hung between them, quiet, wordless, undeniable. When she finally sat across from him, sharing the glow of a single flame, the mansion felt smaller than it ever had. The storm outside was still raging, but inside, something else had begun to calm. Neither of them realized that this night would become a fracture line in both their lives, the point after which silence would never again feel safe. For in that fragile pause between thunderclaps, Jeffery Williams, the man who hated women, began to recognize the strange, steady rhythm of trust. It was faint. It was frightening. But it was real. And as lightning illuminated the room, revealing their faces for a fleeting instant, the universe seemed to whisper what both were too afraid to admit. Sometimes the only way to survive the storm is to share its shelter. Outside, the sea continued its endless war against the cliffs. Inside, warmth flickered against cold marble. And for the first time in years, the house that had known nothing but echoes began to breathe again. When fate traps you with the one person who challenges your walls, do you see it as punishment or a chance to change? What would you do if you couldn't escape the one who made you feel again? The storm passed by dawn, but it didn't take the silence with it. It lingered, heavy and listening. Olivia stood by the window, watching as thin ribbons of morning light pierced the horizon. The ocean below was calmer now, though fragments of last night's fury still foamed against the rocks. The mansion looked changed in this new light, less like a fortress, more like a confession. Jeffrey hadn't spoken much since the night before. He'd thanked her once, quietly, then disappeared into the study. But something subtle had shifted. The air between them wasn't avoidance anymore. It was awareness. Awareness of what had almost surfaced when the world went dark. awareness of what neither dared to name. The morning carried a strange stillness, and for Olivia, it stirred something deeper. Memory. Storms had always awakened her ghosts. She remembered being 10 years old, sitting in a hospital room that smelled faintly of bleach and rain. Her father's voice had been soft, cracked at the edges, telling her that life would always test the strong. But strength, he'd said, isn't silence. It's love that keeps working, even when nobody notices. She had carried those words ever since, through kitchens, cities, disappointments. Every meal she made was a fragment of that promise. That kindness could still matter, even in a world that had forgotten how to taste it. Jeffrey didn't know that yet, but he would. He spent the morning in the study, eyes fixed on meaningless documents, mind wandering through places he swore he'd never revisit. Memories didn't knock anymore. They broke in uninvited. The storm had opened a door he couldn't close. He remembered the last woman he had trusted. Her laughter had been bright, her ambition sharper. She'd come into his life like sunlight, only to vanish with a trail of betrayal. It hadn't been the loss of love that hardened him. It was the humiliation of believing he could still be loved for who he was. After that, he'd decided emotion was a liability. Relationships were negotiations. Affection was leverage. And so he built his world on precision, removing anything that might remind him of human imperfection. Until her. Olivia had entered quietly, without promises or demands. She hadn't tried to impress him, hadn't feared his silence. She had simply existed, authentically, stubbornly. And that authenticity, so rare in his curated world, was beginning to unravel him. By midday, the power had been restored, and the mansion's artificial rhythm returned. Lights humming, screens flickering, systems obeying. Yet the world felt different. Technology couldn't erase what the storm had revealed. Jeffrey walked into the kitchen that afternoon, under the guise of checking generator systems. In truth, he was drawn there by something less rational, a need to see her. She was humming again, that same gentle tune he'd heard before, but softer now. The melody carried a kind of endurance, a way of telling the world, "I'm still here." He watched from the doorway, unnoticed for a while. He saw the faint scar on her wrist, the careful way she stirred the pot, the exhaustion tucked behind her posture. These were not signs of fragility, but of someone who had survived without losing her grace. And for the first time he wondered what she'd survived. When she finally sensed his presence, she turned. Not startled, just aware. He said nothing, and neither did she. But something in the silence shifted again. It wasn't cold this time, it was fragile. The kind of quiet that asks questions neither of them knew how to answer. He wanted to ask her about the music she hummed, about why she never looked away, about what drove her to care so much about things most people overlooked. But the words wouldn't come. He didn't know how to ask without revealing that he cared. The hours that followed blurred between work and thought. Jeffrey found himself wandering through memories he'd long buried, his mother's departure, his father's bitterness, the emptiness that came from learning success could not be inherited, but loneliness could. He realized something unsettling. He had modeled his life after absence. Every wall, every rule, every silence, an echo of loss disguised as control. Olivia, meanwhile, carried her own ghosts quietly. In the still moments between preparing meals, she found herself thinking about her father's laughter, about the nights when the electricity would go out and they'd cook by candlelight. Those were the happiest memories she had. Poverty wrapped in warmth, struggle softened by love. And now in this mansion of glass she felt that same paradox again. Coldness and comfort, distance and closeness. Fate, it seemed, had a cruel sense of poetry. Later that evening she returned to the kitchen to find something left on the counter, a simple note written in Jeffrey's precise angular handwriting. It wasn't a command, it wasn't business. It said only, "Dinner was memorable. Thank you." She stared at the note for a long moment, her heart caught between disbelief and something gentler. For a man like him, gratitude was not casual. It was confession. What she didn't know was how long he had debated writing it. How many times he'd crumpled the paper, rewritten it, folded and unfolded it again before leaving it there. It wasn't the message itself that mattered. It was the surrender of silence it represented. That night, neither of them slept easily. The mansion felt smaller now, as though the walls had learned to listen. Jeffrey sat by his window, watching the moonlight ripple across the sea, wondering when solitude had stopped feeling safe. Olivia lay awake in her small guest quarters, thinking of the man who thanked her with words that sounded like they cost him something. Two hearts, both wary of connection, now carried fragments of each other's stories without ever speaking them aloud. The next morning, the air was softer, the sea calmer. Something invisible had begun to bridge the gap between them, not through conversation or touch, but through understanding. And though they didn't know it yet, the truth that had begun to surface, the memories, the pain, the quiet resilience, was only the beginning, because to heal they would have to face not just each other, but the reflections they'd spent their lives avoiding. Morning came slowly, carrying with it a gentler kind of light. The storm had stripped the sky clean, leaving it pale and open, almost forgiving. The mansion for once did not hum with automation. The silence that filled it was different now, not oppressive, not empty, but patient, like the pause before a conversation that finally matters. Olivia arrived early that day. She moved quietly through the kitchen, still unsure of what the previous days meant. Something fragile had been born between her and the man upstairs, though neither of them dared to name it. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't affection. It was recognition. Recognition that loneliness had a twin. Jeffrey rose late. He had spent most of the night replaying fragments of the storm, of her candlelit calm, of the way her eyes had met his with neither fear nor pity. He wasn't used to being remembered by someone who didn't want anything from him. In her presence, the rules of his world felt rewritten. He descended the stairs mid-morning, no plan in mind, no speech prepared. Just a strange pull he no longer had the strength to ignore. When he entered the kitchen, Olivia was already there, sunlight catching the stray curls at her temple, her sleeves rolled up, her hands working rhythmically through a bowl of flour. She looked ordinary and extraordinary at once, like peace disguised as work. He didn't speak, but she noticed him. She always did. Something about her unflinching calm disarmed him again. It wasn't defiance, it was quiet acceptance, the kind that said, "You don't scare me. You just hurt." And in that, Jeffrey felt seen. The hours that followed moved differently. The mansion felt softer, more human. Olivia worked. He stayed, finding excuses to linger nearby. Occasionally their eyes met, briefly, fleetingly, but each time, something wordless passed between them. At lunch, she left a plate on the counter without asking. He ate it standing up, watching her move about the kitchen. It was the first meal he'd taken in her presence without discomfort. The silence between them no longer demanded escape. It felt natural. It was then, somewhere between the soft clatter of dishes and the faint hum of the refrigerator, that something shifted again, not loudly, but inevitably. Jeffrey realized he was breathing easier. He hadn't laughed, hadn't even smiled, but the constant tightness in his chest had loosened. The mansion no longer felt like a monument to isolation. It felt like a space, waiting to be lived in. Olivia noticed the change too, though she couldn't explain it. There was a quietness in him now that didn't come from pride, but from peace. He moved slower, as if relearning gravity. The afternoon light slanted across the floor, warm and gold. Jeffrey found himself asking questions, not aloud, but within. When did her presence stop feeling like intrusion? When did silence become comfort? The answers came not in words, but in the rhythm of her hands, in the scent of bread rising in the oven, in the sunlight that painted her hair the color of honey. The world outside might have still seen him as a fortress of glass and numbers, but inside these walls, he was beginning to feel something dangerous and holy. Connection. Evening came like a soft exhale. Olivia finished early and began cleaning up. Jeffrey lingered nearby, restless in a way that wasn't unpleasant. The air between them was full of unfinished sentences neither dared to speak. He wanted to thank her again, but thank you felt too small. What he really wanted to say was, "You're undoing me, and I don't know whether to run or stay." She wiped the counter, feeling his presence behind her. She didn't turn. Some silences are too sacred to break. The clock ticked softly. The ocean murmured below. Time stretched, unhurried, forgiving. Later that night, she prepared a small dinner for both of them. Simple, warm, human. For the first time, he joined her willingly. They sat opposite each other at the long dining table, the same table that had once felt like a barrier. Now it felt like a bridge. The candles flickered. Neither spoke much. They didn't need to. Every glance, every small gesture said enough. She noticed the way he relaxed his shoulders when she smiled. He noticed how her hands stilled when she sensed his attention. It was as if their unspoken griefs were learning how to coexist. After the meal, Jeffrey didn't leave the table. He stayed, his gaze distant but softer than before. The kind of softness that only appears when someone begins to trust the air again. Olivia gathered the dishes, careful not to disturb the quiet. When she passed by him, he looked up. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met, and in that small space between glances, both of them understood what words could never hold. He was beginning to feel again, and she was beginning to believe again. It wasn't love yet. It was healing. And healing, for two people who had lived too long without it, felt like the rarest kind of intimacy. That night, Jeffrey didn't retreat to his study. Instead, he walked through the mansion's empty halls, noticing things he'd never seen before. The way the light curved across the staircase, the scent of bread lingering in the air, the faint echo of her humming that seemed to follow him even after she was gone. The loneliness that had once been his comfort now felt too large, too hollow. For the first time, he wished someone else were there. Olivia, in her small room on the lower floor, lay awake again. But her thoughts were softer now. She thought of the man upstairs and the way his silence had begun to change shape. Once it had been armor. Now it was vulnerability trying to find its voice. She didn't know where this strange connection would lead. She only knew that something inside her, long dormant, had begun to stir again. Hope. And hope, even in its smallest form, can change everything. The sea outside whispered against the rocks, steady and eternal. Inside the mansion, two hearts, long exiled from gentleness, began to drift toward each other, slowly, cautiously, beautifully. They were still afraid, but fear, at least now, had company. Have you ever met someone whose quiet presence began to heal you before either of you said a word? Do you believe peace can be found in shared silence? Tell me in the comments what healing together means to you. The calm that followed was deceptive, the kind that comes before something breaks. For several days, peace lingered in the mansion like soft music. Jeffrey and Olivia moved in quiet synchrony, sharing space without collision. The meals she made became smaller, more personal. The air, lighter. The silence that once suffocated now felt tender, filled with what neither dared to name. But peace, especially in a heart unfamiliar with it, is fragile. It can feel too close to danger. And for Jeffery Williams, danger was something to control or destroy. It began with an email, a simple one, just a few words, from a name he hadn't seen in years. It came from the woman who'd broken him, the one who had walked away with not only his trust, but a piece of his humanity. She was back in the country, she said. She wanted to talk. The message wasn't the problem. It was what it awakened, the reminder that love, in his experience, always ended in loss. By the time Olivia entered the kitchen that morning, Jeffrey's old armor had already begun to slide back into place. His movements were brisk, his tone clipped. He didn't linger in the doorway. He didn't pause to watch her. The warmth she'd grown used to was gone, replaced by the cold efficiency of the man she'd first met. She felt it instantly, the shift in energy, the air tightening between them. Something unseen but powerful had turned. The next days unfolded in uneasy silence. Jeffrey avoided her. The soft looks, the subtle pauses, the quiet dinners, all vanished. The connection they'd built seemed to evaporate overnight, leaving behind confusion and ache. Olivia didn't understand. She replayed their last interactions over and over, searching for something she'd done wrong, but there was nothing. Only his distance. Only the quiet closing of doors. Jeffrey told himself it was necessary, that this retreat was protection, not cruelty. He couldn't afford to feel again, not after what happened last time. He had let warmth in before, and it had burned him to the ground, and yet, the ache that followed this withdrawal was sharper than he expected. He caught himself missing her laughter, the faint hum that filled his mornings, the way her presence softened the edges of his loneliness. But he told himself it was weakness, not longing. He told himself walls were safer than windows. Olivia sensed the change but refused to give up on kindness. She continued cooking with care, even though he rarely came down to eat. She left small notes instead of words, a recipe card with a smiley face, a cup of tea left on the counter, a plate covered with a napkin and a quiet hope. But the silence became unbearable. One evening, as the sun fell in a wash of crimson across the sea, she found herself standing in the hallway outside his study. Her hand hovered over the door, her heart heavy with something she couldn't name. She wanted to understand. She needed to. Inside, Jeffrey sat surrounded by ghosts, his past mistakes, his broken trust, the cold weight of guilt. He wasn't angry at her. He was terrified of himself, of how much she'd begun to matter, how easily she could hurt him without meaning to. When he heard her knock, he froze. The sound was gentle, uncertain, full of hope, and it broke something inside him. He couldn't open the door. He wanted to. God, he wanted to. But the years of silence, betrayal, and loss rose like a tide inside him, drowning every instinct for connection. She waited a few seconds more. Then quietly she turned and left. The click of her footsteps receding down the hallway sounded louder than thunder. That night she didn't stay to cook dinner. She gathered her things and retreated to her small room. She told herself it was just a job, that she didn't owe him her heart. But in the quiet that followed, she realized something painful. She had already given him pieces of it. Jeffrey felt her absence immediately. The kitchen was dark, the air still. The scent of her cooking was gone, replaced by the sterile emptiness he once called peace. He poured himself a drink he wouldn't finish, staring into the amber liquid as if it held an answer. But answers never come to men who choose silence. By morning, the mansion had reverted to its old rhythm, cold, efficient, lifeless. Yet even the walls seemed to remember warmth. The air carried her absence like perfume. He told himself it was better this way, that she deserved better than his brokenness, his walls, his ghosts. But deep down, he knew the truth. He wasn't protecting her. He was hiding from her. And hiding from her meant hiding from himself. Olivia worked her final hours that day in quiet resignation. She packed her knives, her notes, her favorite spice jars. She told herself it was time to move on. That love, if that's what this strange ache was, wasn't for her. But when she stepped outside into the fading light, the ocean wind carrying the scent of salt and memory, she felt tears she couldn't stop. Because somewhere inside that cold mansion, she had found something fragile and real, and now she was leaving it behind. Jeffrey watched her from the window as she walked toward the gates. He didn't move, didn't call her name. He just watched until she disappeared from sight, and in that silence, something inside him shattered completely. For the first time in years, the man who hated women didn't feel hatred at all. He felt loss. Real, raw, human loss. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the truth settled like ash around him. Walls don't keep pain out. They only keep love from finding a way in. Have you ever pushed someone away? Not because they hurt you, but because you were afraid they could? Do you believe fear or pride has ruined more love stories? Let's talk about it below. Days passed like unspoken apologies. The mansion stood quiet again, the way Jeffrey had once preferred it. Flawless, empty, untouched. Yet now, the silence pressed against him like a weight. It followed him from room to room, heavy as regret. Everywhere he looked, she lingered. Her laughter seemed trapped between the walls. Her scent haunted the kitchen. Even the sea outside sounded different, less alive, less forgiving. He told himself he'd made the right choice, that letting her go was mercy. But mercy shouldn't feel like bleeding. Work piled up, meetings blurred together. He hid behind numbers, contracts, and deals that meant nothing. The man the world still saw, the unshakable billionaire, was only a ghost walking through his own success. At night he wandered through dark halls, stopping at the kitchen door. He'd stand there in silence, half expecting to hear her humming again. But all that greeted him was emptiness, and the memory of her eyes steady and full of grace even when he pushed her away. Sometimes regret doesn't roar, it whispers. Olivia tried to forget too. She took small catering jobs, smiled for clients, and filled her days with movement. But each time she cooked, something was missing. The meaning behind the act, the invisible thread that had tied her art to something greater than herself. She missed the stillness of the mansion at dawn, the sound of the ocean, the man she shouldn't have cared for but did, and somewhere deep down, she knew he missed her too. But pride is a cruel guardian. It convinces the heart that silence is strength, that loneliness is dignity. Until one evening, a small brown envelope arrived at Olivia's door. No sender, no name, just a wax seal pressed into cream paper. Inside, a note written in a hand she knew too well. The kitchen feels empty without you, but I understand if it's too late. J.W. No promises, no apologies, just truth stripped bare. She read it 3 times. Her hands trembled, her heart torn between ache and anger. It wasn't enough, and yet it was everything. For hours, she sat at her small kitchen table staring at the letter. Every part of her wanted to guard herself, to move on, to choose safety. But safety had never made her heart beat like this. Across the city, Jeffrey sat in his study, staring at his phone. He hadn't expected her to answer. Maybe he didn't even deserve her answer. The letter had been a risk, a fragment of courage from a man who'd spent years running from it. He thought of her often now, not as a disruption but as a mirror. Through her he'd seen what he could be if he stopped hiding, and that frightened him more than solitude ever had. The next morning he found himself walking toward the ocean. The waves crashed against the rocks below his mansion, echoing like distant applause. For once he didn't try to silence his thoughts. He let them speak. He saw his father's anger, his mother's silence, the betrayals that had built his armor. He saw the boy who'd been taught to conquer instead of connect. And then he saw Olivia, the woman who had walked into his fortress and asked for nothing but honesty. He realized then that every wall he'd built had been for protection, but in doing so, he'd imprisoned himself. Sometimes freedom isn't about breaking chains, it's about opening the door you locked yourself. That night, as the wind carried the scent of rain, a knock echoed through Olivia's apartment. When she opened the door, she didn't find Jeffrey standing there. Just a small box tied with a black ribbon. Inside was a single key and a note. One last dinner. If you still cook for me tonight, I'll finally learn to listen. Her breath caught. The key was for the mansion. For a long time she stared at it. Fear whispered in her ear, "He'll hurt you again." But hope spoke louder, "He's trying." And sometimes that's enough. As twilight deepened, Olivia found herself driving toward the coast. The road curved along the cliffs, the sky burning gold. With each mile, her heartbeat grew steadier. This wasn't foolishness. It was choice. Inside the mansion, Jeffery waited, not as the man who demanded control, but as the man finally ready to surrender it. The table was bare except for 2 candles and a simple bouquet of rosemary and thyme, her favorites. When he heard the sound of her footsteps in the foyer, he closed his eyes for a moment. The echo of her presence was both terrifying and beautiful. He didn't go to meet her. He waited. Because love, he had learned, wasn't about possession. It was about patience. Olivia entered the kitchen first. Everything was exactly as she'd left it, except for the plate he'd placed in the center of the counter. A single note rested on top. "Teach me how to begin again." The words were few, but they carried the weight of everything he hadn't known how to say. She stood there for a long time, eyes wet, heart trembling. Then she set her bag down and rolled up her sleeves. When Jeffery finally walked in, she didn't turn. She began cooking just as she had the first day she'd arrived. Quietly, gracefully, with care. But the air between them had changed. This wasn't a job anymore. This was a conversation without words. And for the first time, Jeffery understood. Love isn't always spoken aloud. Sometimes it's felt in the way someone stays, despite every reason to leave. As the scent of food filled the room, he moved beside her. Not too close, not too far. Their silence was no longer a wall. It was a promise. The meal they shared that night wasn't grand. It was humble, honest, healing. Each moment stretched like a fragile thread between forgiveness and hope. By the time the candles burned low, both of them knew something had changed. He wasn't the same man who'd pushed her away, and she wasn't the same woman who'd walked out. They had both been broken. Now, they were choosing to be brave. Have you ever been given a second chance that scared you more than the first? What does forgiveness mean when love has already hurt once? Share your thoughts below. The night settled softly over the coast, the ocean whispering beneath a moon that seemed to hold its breath. Inside the mansion, something sacred was unfolding, not grand, not loud, but undeniably real. Jeffery and Olivia sat across from each other at the same table where silence had once been their enemy. Now, it was an ally, a living, breathing witness to their quiet rebirth. The candles flickered gently between them, their flames mirrored in the glass walls that looked out over the sea. Everything seemed to echo with memory. The night she'd first cooked for him, the way the storm had forced them to see one another, the distance that had once felt unbridgeable. Now there was no distance left, only 2 souls learning to breathe in rhythm again. Jeffery didn't speak much. He didn't need to. The apology he'd spent years resisting had already been written in his actions, in the invitation, in the waiting, in the willingness to sit before her without armor. Olivia didn't ask for explanations. She didn't demand promises. She had already seen the truth inside him, and that was enough. Sometimes healing isn't about changing the past. It's about choosing not to run from it anymore. As they finished the meal, Jeffery rose slowly and moved toward the kitchen window. Outside, the ocean shimmered in the moonlight, the same ocean that had mirrored his isolation, now reflecting something entirely new. He realized that, for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what he'd lost. He was thinking about what he could build. Behind him, Olivia stood and began clearing the table, her movements gentle and deliberate. There was a rhythm between them now, a quiet understanding that no words could capture. Each glance, each small gesture was a thread weaving them closer. Jeffery turned toward her, his expression open, unguarded. He watched her hands, the same hands that had created warmth in his coldest rooms, and understood something simple but life-changing. Love wasn't about conquest or control. It was about creation. In the space of her presence, he had found the courage to rebuild himself. Later that night, they stepped outside together. The air was cool, salt brushing their faces as the wind whispered through the trees. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, vast, unbroken, and free. They walked in silence, their footsteps soft against the stone path. The mansion glowed behind them, no longer a fortress but a home, one that had finally learned to breathe. Jeffery stopped near the edge of the cliff, where the sea crashed against the rocks below. For years, this view had been his escape, a place where he could drown out his thoughts. But tonight he saw it differently. It wasn't an abyss anymore. It was possibility. He turned to Olivia, the moonlight tracing the lines of her face, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look at a woman with fear. He looked with gratitude. There was no grand confession, no dramatic kiss. Just a quiet moment where understanding passed between them like the tide. She had taught him that love didn't need to be loud to be true. It only needed to be real. When she smiled, it wasn't a declaration. It was forgiveness. For him, for herself, for the pain that had led them both here. Jeffery exhaled, a breath years overdue. The tension in his chest eased, replaced by something lighter, warmer. He reached for her hand and she let him take it. The contact was small, almost fragile, yet it held the weight of everything they'd endured. The waves below seemed to applaud quietly, their rhythm steady, eternal. Inside the mansion, the clock struck midnight. The same hour the storm had once changed everything. But this time, it didn't bring chaos. It brought peace. They stood there for a long time, neither speaking, neither needing to. The world around them was vast, yet in that moment, it felt like it existed only for the two of them. Olivia thought about how strange fate could be, how she'd entered his life through a simple job posting, never realizing she'd be the one to help him rediscover his humanity. And he, in turn, had reminded her that even the gentlest hearts could be seen, cherished, protected. They had both been survivors of their own loneliness, and now they were witnesses to each other's rebirth. When they finally returned inside, the mansion felt alive again. Laughter waiting to return, music waiting to fill its halls. The kitchen light glowed warmly, casting a soft halo over the room where it had all begun. Jeffery paused before the counter, where her apron still hung. He lifted it gently, folding it with care. It was no longer a symbol of her employment. It was the thread of their story. He placed it beside the rosemary bouquet she'd once left him and smiled faintly. For a man who had built empires, this small act felt like his greatest accomplishment. Olivia stood in the doorway watching him. She saw not the billionaire, not the recluse, but the man who had finally allowed himself to feel. And in that, she saw hope. Not only for him, but for herself. Because love, real love, doesn't fix you. It frees you. As dawn began to rise, the first light spilled across the sea and into the kitchen. The new day painted everything in gold. Olivia began to brew coffee, the familiar scent filling the air. Jeffery watched her from across the room, his heart steady, his silence full of meaning. He no longer hated women. He no longer hated love. He simply understood it. Fragile, imperfect, essential. The woman who had walked into his home as a stranger had become the compass that led him back to himself. And as the sun climbed higher, he realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of being seen. He had found peace in the most unexpected place, in her quiet, in her strength, in her belief that even the most guarded hearts can learn to love again. The ocean continued to whisper below, eternal and true. Above it, two souls, once lost in silence, began again. Not as savior and saved, not as billionaire and chef, but simply as two people brave enough to try. Do you believe love can truly change someone? Not just their habits, but their soul? Have you ever witnessed someone become softer because they were finally understood? Share your thoughts below. Your story might inspire someone else's healing. That was just the beginning. The next story's even more insane. Click now